This issue of instinctive negativity towards those who are not observant really gets in the way of feelings we need to have, of expressions of gratitude, of expressions of solidarity, the statements beyond whether Charedim should be in the drift. It is very frustrating to listen to the statements of their politicians and their rabbis about the drift. One of their Chavrei Knesset, Philip Golkaf, said that being in the Beit Midrash is harder than being on the front lines. If he just knew or identified with Jews who actually go to the army, you couldn't say such a thing. And in my mind, it's incredibly insensitive.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. Schools which identify with the modern Orthodox world and espouse a centrist Orthodox hashkafa nevertheless will sometimes hire teachers who profess a Hareidi worldview. In some ways, this is a welcome development. Breaking down the barriers that separate our various communities is generally a good thing, and we should be pleased when we discern a willingness to engage Jews with different viewpoints. On the other hand, it seems to me that modern Orthodox institutions are more willing to hire Torah teachers who hail from ultra-Orthodox communities than the other way around. And according to Rabbi Yitzchak Blau, there may be some serious, albeit unintended, consequences to this willingness that modern Orthodox Jews may find troubling. Rabbi Blau wrote an article in the journal Conversations entitled The Hareidi Option, where he outlines some of the messages that our children and students may be hearing from their Hareidi teachers and books, which most modern Orthodox Jews would find extremely objectionable. In these troubling times, we often take comfort when we see that the people of Israel is unified together in common cause. We cannot forget, though, that unity can sometimes be used as a cudgel in order to stifle dissent. Sometimes the voices that call out for unity the loudest are those that want to maintain the status quo and then declare that any criticism or call for change is an attempt to undermine our national unity and consensus. Let me read what I wrote in my Substack about 6 months ago in an article entitled Real Jewish Unity. When is unity a value, and when is unity a danger? The answer is apparent in Mishnah Avot, chapter 5, Mishnah 20, where we are taught, any argument which is for the sake of heaven, it is destined to last. Whereas if it is not for the sake of heaven, it is not destined to last. What is an argument which is for the sake of heaven? This is the argument of Hillel and Shammai. And not for the sake of heaven? This is the argument of Korach and his congregation. Two anomalies are immediately apparent, one conceptual and one textual. The conceptual problem is that the Mishnah asserts that an argument for the sake of heaven, that is, an unselfish argument between people trying to discern the truth, will last permanently. Typically, we think that we should overcome disagreements, ultimately discovering a conclusion which puts the argument to bed. Chazal, however, say the opposite, that an unselfish argument will never be resolved, whereas a selfish argument will achieve eventual closure. The textual anomaly is that the two clauses of the Mishnah are not parallel. While an argument for the sake of heaven is typified by the disagreements between Hillel and Shammai, the argument not for the sake of heaven is represented by Korach and his congregation, without the Mishnah explaining against whom Korach and his congregation were arguing. These two anomalies are the keys to understanding the difference between the positive unity of Jacob and his family and the negative unity exemplified by Egypt and Babel. The members of the house of Hillel argued vociferously with the house of Shammai, while fully admitting that their opponents were nonetheless reading the sources fairly, objectively, and without personal biases. Disagreement of this sort acknowledges the humanity and selfless motivations of one's opponent, while simultaneously believing in the rightness of one's own position. These disagreements are not resolved, nor should they be. The persistence of disagreement helps us sharpen, alter, or even reverse our own position, while also providing insight into the multifaceted complexity of our imperfect world. Of course, as a matter of practical implementation, one side must emerge as the victor, but acting according to the dictates of one opinion does not make a dissenting opinion disappear, nor should it. Intellectual richness is a consequence of nuanced understanding of complicated issues, and this may only occur if those with whom we disagree are given a fair hearing. In contrast, the vilification of an intellectual opponent, or the claim that his opinion is not even worth hearing, or the determination that he has no right to his opinion at all, leads to mandatory groupthink, a fear of new ideas, and shallow beliefs that, because of their fragility, are ultimately defended with the sword rather than with argumentation. When an intellectual adversary is dehumanized and his opinions made to disappear, both sides are diminished and society itself steps closer to oblivion. Hillel and Shammai argued, while acknowledging each other's honesty and positive motivations. They had the same goal, to make the Torah great and glorious, while disagreeing about the best way to achieve it. Jewish law follows the house of Hillel, but the continued presence of the house of Shammai contributes to the depth and subtlety of halachic discourse. This is an argument for the sake of heaven that contributes to unity, and which should never be resolved in such a way that one side disappears. This is the unity of Jacob and his family, all of whom march toward the same goal, each one doing so in an individual and distinct manner. Unlike Hillel and Shammai, Korach refused to talk to Moshe in order to resolve their differences. From his perspective, there was only one side of the argument. His opponent effectively did not exist. An argument of this kind is not a true argument, but a selfish and arrogant assertion that lacks any semblance of self-reflection and adds nothing to society's larger conversation. In contrast to an argument for the sake of heaven, where both sides contribute to a deeper understanding of the issues at hand, Korach's argument benefited no one but himself. Society is better off when this argument is no longer on the table. In spite of what I wrote above, I certainly acknowledge that there are some arguments in which one side should be absolutely rejected rather than being treated with the respect that we normally accord those with whom we disagree. Should a Nazi or a Hamas supporter claim that the world would be better off without Israel or the Jewish people, we need not engage him in respectful disputation. His ideas embody a fundamental evil and should be rejected forthwith. But if a person's normal method of argumentation includes the vilification and absolute rejection of an opponent as a matter of course, he is falling into the trap of Korach and those whose arguments are distinctly not for the sake of heaven. This again comes from an article I wrote in December entitled Real Jewish Unity. This now brings me back to Rabbi Blau's critique of the Hareidi messages that we may be imbibing without even realizing it. Rabbi Blau calls himself a passionate believer in modern orthodoxy, and when the beliefs of modern orthodoxy are being undermined by people who don't accept them, a passionate believer has the right and probably the obligation to protest. While some may say that this is undermining the unity of Am Yisrael, I strongly disagree. Unity which demands not only the same goals, but also a single way to reach that goal with no dissent allowed, is a form of fascism, not Torah-based unity. In this episode, Rabbi Blau and I talked about the specific messages he believes that modern orthodoxy is receiving and that need to be called out and identified before our students almost unconsciously adopt them. Among the areas we discussed are differing attitudes towards women, Gentiles, secular Jews, the Zionist movement, the Israeli army, divine providence, the role of great Torah scholars, and more. We'll get to that conversation in a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. My latest article is entitled The Paradox of Jewish Power, where I argue that some of the most ardent believers in the miraculous nature of the Six-Day War are also some of the most ardent advocates of the invincibility of the Israeli army, and that this paradoxical attitude can have serious consequences. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. One of the main topics that I've addressed on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast and in my Substack over the past 8 months has been the future of religious Zionism, both in Israel and in the diaspora. There are numerous versions of what religious Zionism should be, and understanding the possibilities should be at the very top of the agenda in both the national religious and modern Orthodox worlds. Because this topic matters to me so much, I was honored to have our first ever JCH pop-up coffee house last week in Manhattan, where a group of us discussed the future of religious Zionism. I was very pleased with the conversation and the opportunity to meet with engaged listeners to the Orthodox Conundrum, and I'm very excited to have more events like this one in the future. If you are interested in hosting a JCH pop-up coffee house, please write to aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com and let's discuss the possibilities. Finally, in 2024, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com, and let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rabbi Yitzchak Blau is a Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshivat Oraita and also teaches at Midreshet Lindenbaum. He is an associate editor of Tradition and the author of Fresh Fruit and Vintage Wine, The Ethics and Wisdom of the Agadah. One final note. I recorded this podcast while I was in New York for my nephew's bar mitzvah. I wasn't using my normal studio or equipment, and you may notice that the audio occasionally drops out for a second or two. I apologize for that, and rest assured that those infrequent blips do not negatively affect the podcast. In fact, it's an episode that I found to be unusually fascinating and provocative. Rabbi Yitzchak Blau, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
It is great to be here, Scott.
I want to ask you about your recent article and conversation. Specifically, what was the problem that needed to be identified such that you decided to do so? What were you trying to combat?
Okay, so it's a little bit funny because I don't want to make it into an athletic competition, but there's a little bit of a sense, so to speak, that our team is losing. So just to explain what that means, I'm a passionate believer in modern orthodoxy, and I'd like that ideology to be successful and to spread. And I think there's a real sense that much of our world is kind of moving away from that. I'll just give you two examples. One would be, and let's say the high school level in North America, especially if one is in the single sex high schools, but even more in the co-ed. Often, most of the staff is either flat out Hareidi or perhaps YU Yeshivish, whatever gradation you want to use. And you really won't have that many teachers who, passionately believe in modern orthodoxy. So that was a frustration for me. And then that gets continued when they come to Israel for the year to yeshiva or seminary. Again, there are obviously exceptions, but many yeshivot and seminaries, that is the dominant message they're getting. And even if it's not the dominant message, it is a very significant message. Just to give you one example, it's actually a very good seminary that prides itself that its staff is 50% modern Orthodox and 50% Haredi. So there is something very noble about it. But wait, but if you actually believe in modern Orthodoxy, why should you have a 50-50 staff? You have some Haredi staff members on staff, but don't you want to have an essential message? So again, there are various factors why we're in this situation, and certainly modern Orthodoxy deserves some of the blame. But I wanted to articulate reasons why we should, stick to our guns, not follow this trend and this momentum. That's all one. And the second thing I would say is that I think as I grow older, I become more alarmed by some of the excesses or problems of the Haredi world. Certainly what's going on now in terms of draft affirmed in Israel might be the most powerful example, but it's not the only one. So I guess that would be my answer, a sense that there's a certain sense of lost momentum that we have to recover, and realization that the Haredi world has some really deep issues that might make us more wary of moving over to that approach.
In that case, you mentioned that you're a passionate believer in modern orthodoxy. Perhaps we should define our terms before we go any further. Yitzchak, in your mind, how do you define the term modern orthodoxy?
Okay, look, that's a great question, because I have about 8 or 9 characteristics, and obviously they don't always have to go together. But I'll just list them very briefly. Certainly attitude to the state of Israel and the army is a big part of it. That's one. Clearly, in Israel itself, that often is the more pronounced issue. Beyond that, attitude to the broader world, and that's a general question, but more specifically, the value of non-Jewish wisdom. Often in America, college education was the dividing line. Where again, Haredim might go to college as well, but it would be on purely pragmatic terms. Sense is one needs a job, so one goes to college. Not that there's a wisdom to be attained there. Then attitude to other groups. Okay, there's a strong sense, I think, in modern Orthodoxy that we're looking to give women more opportunities, obviously within the halachic system, but what can be done within the system. Attitude to non-Jews, attitude to secular Jews. I think those are all part of it. Different roles of rabbinic authority. Certainly, I think in the Haredi world, rabbinic. By the way, I would say it's not just Das Torah. That's part of it. Like whether rabbis have a say in political issues or personal issues. I would also say it's even just how dominant Gedolim are in your religious discourse. Like you could have a discourse that, of course, we care about great rabbis, but that's the dominant part of the discourse. You can have another discourse that's what it's at. It's at stories about Gedolim and which Gedol said what, and that becomes the major emphasis of one's religious posture. So I would say that as well. I think different approaches to divine providence is a big issue, which I think does have I think it's a good example where an abstract theological question has real life implications. Like, what do we think really runs the world? Is the natural order an illusion, as Rav Dessler would have it, or is the natural order actually the way the world works, as the Rambam would have it? Right? I think it's a pretty big difference in terms of how much effort you'll put into natural solutions to problems, and the mitzvot save the world. maybe we'll stop here, but I think it's a pretty long list. I could go further if you want.
That is a very long list. In fact, as you're saying those items, I'm thinking to myself, we may need to have a second podcast just to talk about what modern orthodoxy is, because leaving it at that is a bit underwhelming for me. I want to hear more. Nevertheless, because that's not our topic today, we're more talking about attitudes towards the Hareidi world within modern orthodoxy. Perhaps we'll move forward. Many people would agree with you in principle, saying that there are issues with modern Orthodox Jews, as you say, if we really passionately believe in this way of life and don't look at it as a b'di'evet, as something which is only done after the fact, it's not the best way of doing things, then we shouldn't be overly influenced by people who have a fundamentally different philosophy. At the same time, though, while you are, in your article and conversations, making a very strong argument that we have to be true to ourselves, a lot of the people whom you cite are some of the greatest gedolim of the past century. For example, you have several examples there where you say things, or at least quote someone quoting Rav Moshe Feinstein, and I can't imagine any gadol with the stature of Rav Moshe Feinstein. So some people might say, what you were saying, Rabbi Blau, makes a lot of sense, but so to speak, how dare you go up against Rav Moshe Feinstein? So I'll ask that question, and let me just say it really has two parts. Number one, on an intellectual level, how can people like us say, Rav Moshe, you're wrong? And secondly, on a more spiritual level, this might get into the divine providence issue. How can people like you dare to combat the Gedolim? How can you go up against the Gedolim and tell them they're wrong? Even if intellectually you disagree with them, they deserve a certain amount of respect, either practically or spiritually, such that how dare you have the audacity, the temerity to go up and tell them that they're wrong?
Okay, great question. I think we're going to discover that I often have three categories when we get to answers. I don't know why, but some of them, I'm always three. So we're going to go with three here also. Number one, some of the things I quote are kind of secondhand, meaning if it's Rav Dessler's Michtam Eliyahu, so he wrote that. If it's Rabbi Shurkin quoting stories about Rav Moshe, so I'll freely say I'm not convinced Rav Shurkin always got the stories correctly. It may be, at that point, the problem is not that Rav Moshe thought so. The problem is these are the stories being told in the Hareidi world. I think some of the stories are not accurate. It's just very difficult for me to believe that Rav Moshe thought that finding a cure for cancer was bittul Torah. I find that pretty hard to believe, and that is what Shurkin says. So maybe one response might be, we don't think Rav Moshe actually said that, or there was some real context to that sentence, but actually this is what Shurkin teaches. And since that's what he teaches, this is still an issue that has to be confronted. That'd be my first category. My second category would be, what if we're dealing with a machloket? Like a lot of hashkafa has machloket, and we might be saying at that point that, okay, this great rabbi really did say it, but another great rabbi disagrees, and not everybody can be right all the time. Like, let's say we're trying to figure out, is secular Zionism a good thing or not? And there's no denying that many, many Orthodox rabbis did not think so, right? The people who are doing it don't keep Shabbos and don't keep kosher. But Rav Kook thought it was a positive desire to help the Jewish people. Okay, so at this point, I know someone could try to say, well, everybody's right, but you got to decide where your allegiance is. So maybe a second category would be, it's true that I am, as it were, criticizing or rejecting a given position, but I'm doing it based on my own rabbinic authority, my own rabbinic rates, and again, different people would play a role here. Rav Kook, Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Lichtenstein, right? On different issues, different people would be playing an important role. Yeah, now we'll get to the most radical. Okay, again, if I say just that Rav Moshe didn't really say it, or Rav Moshe said it, but Soloveitchik disagrees, I think most people would be comfortable with that. Okay, but I think there is a third category. I think sometimes there is a statement that, I'm not sure which way to say it, is so problematic that I don't think you have to be an equivalent gadol to say this is not correct. Okay, and again, obviously, I would not want everybody plugging this in all the time. Okay, it would totally undermine rabbinic authority. But I think there is a limit. There's a story that Rabbi Bergman wrote stories quoted from Rav Shach. And Rav Shach quotes this story about Rav Chaim Volozhin, where he hides letters from a family to Yeshiva Bacher, because the letters indicated the family was struggling and needed help, and the Yeshiva Bacher should come home. And Rav Chaim Volozhin thought this fellow could become a gadol b'Torah, and it was the Yetzer Hara trying to call him away. So Rav Chaim Volozhin did not show the boy the letters. I'd like to believe that, a relatively educated Balabas could read that story and says, this just can't be. It can't be. This is what Judaism calls for, that we could be cruel to a family in need, and not even let the son know what the family's going through economically and personally, etc. To me, it's just inconceivable. So again, I realize some people find that radical and they'll have a stronger conception of rabbinic authority, but I think there is a little a statement just being so outlandish or so beyond what we think of a reasonable Jew would do that I think we could also say that this can't be.
And in fact, if I recall, in your article, you mentioned that example saying that there were numerous letters expressing increasing levels of despair, the final one being that I think the father died. And according to the story, Rav Chaim Volozhiner also hid that letter too, so the kid didn't even know that his father died.
Yes, I just got, in fact, when I was telling it now, I actually decided to go easy on Rav Chaim Volozhiner. But you're right. If you actually read the progression of letters, it's worse than I portrayed it.
Okay, let's talk specifically, Yitzchak, about some of the specific examples where messages that our modern Orthodox students are getting may be different from messages that those parents of those students might want them to get. Let's begin with the issue of women. What are some of the issues you think that Hareidi attitudes towards women are penetrating into the modern Orthodox world that people might not be happy about if they are modern Orthodox?
Okay, so in the article, I have some more dramatic examples, but I think there are more subtle examples that maybe should be expressed also. The more dramatic examples have to do with value. I think it would be very hard to hear in a modern Orthodox school that the idea that men are more valuable than women, or men are more intelligent than women. Okay, maybe some people think it, but I think you kind of would be embarrassed to say it. Okay, but I give some examples in the article where Haredi literature does have that idea. Okay, the idea that either men are more, or what word you use, ontologically valuable, or that in terms of intelligence, right, women aren't cut out for some things that men are cut out for. Just use an example from a American Rav right now. Rav Aaron Feldman is the Rosh Yeshiva of Ner Yisrael. I did not quote this in the article, but he tries to explain why women shouldn't learn Gemara. Now, he doesn't really say better or worse, but he says there are different kind of thinkers, women. Women are not analytical thinkers, and therefore Gemara is not for them, right? They should be involved in other, maybe they should study Tanakh. That kind of rigorous logical analysis is not for women. Okay, so these are ideas I think that would be, again, I don't mean that is objectionable in the way that saying men are more value is objectionable. Obviously, there's a gradation here. But I think these are things that most modern Orthodox Jews would not be happy about. I'll go a step further, Scott. I did a list actually on Facebook about this, because I wanted to claim that even without those extreme examples, there are many more subtle things. So let's just go through a few of them now. The women's section in Shul, is it accessible? Is it locked? Or do men take it over all the time? So that she's for weekday mincha, she has to kick out 12 men if she wants to come to davening. So I can't say here that all Orthodox shuls have this done well. We feel this sometimes also. But I think this is more of a value in the modern Orthodox community. Okay, women should come to shul. I'll give credit when I went to Hareidi high school. A friend of mine invited myself and my wife to spend Shabbos in Lakewood with them, and it was a great Shabbos. For my wife, it was like eye-opening because she didn't know this world at all. But my wife goes to shul. We didn't have a baby. She goes to shul Friday night. So she went to shul Friday night with myself and my friend Morty, and we show up in the women's section. It's like 100 yeshiva guys in it. But to give credit to my friend, he kicked them all out, and my wife's over there. But that's a very different kind of assumption. Okay, so that would be one.
I will say, though, in that particular case, Yitzchak, my own experience, admittedly anecdotal, is that I have not necessarily found that modern Orthodox shuls are necessarily any better at this. I daven in different shuls at different times, and some of them are careful and some of them are not, and I haven't found a specific divide between modern Orthodox and Haredi, although, again, in my own subjective experience, if there's a shul that's going to be good about it, it's usually going to be a centrist Orthodox shul rather than a Haredi shul.
That's the point. This one's not such a sharp divide. I'll say the same about the second one. But again, I think what you're saying is right, that to the degree that you have a more sensitive shul, it would tend to be modern Orthodox, which would be true of my second one also. Let's say a woman wants, actually, I'll combine two things. Okay, if someone goes through a tragedy, unfortunately, and a woman wants to either say Kaddish or deliver a hesped at the funeral. So in my mind, certainly the hesped case, I don't think is really a halachic issue, and it's something that could be very meaningful. And now it would be meaningful for the relatives. I would say, what if she had the closest relationship with her father? Right? So she should speak, of course. That would be the most meaningful thing. And again, I wouldn't say it's an exact divide, but more likely she'll get the chance to give eulogy at a non-Orthodox funeral than at a Haredi funeral. And so too regarding saying Kaddish. I think it's extremely unlikely she'd be allowed to say Kaddish in a Hareidi minyan. And again, there might be a split, but at some Modern Orthodox minyanim, there'll be a sense that a woman could say Kaddish and have a chance. So that would be another example. One last one, community shiurim, are they going to be co-ed or not? Now, you might think that's not such a big deal because someone could say, well, the women will have their shiurim and they'll have as much Talmud Torah. And there are communities where women have wonderful shiurim. But I think it will often happen, this is a larger educational question, worthy of its own podcast. How often separate but equal really happens, right? And if we say men will have shiurim, women will have shiurim, often the men will have higher level shiurim or the better speakers. Let's say you have a community that has men and women shiurim, and Rav Asher Weiss has an hour. I'm pretty sure Rav Asher Weiss is going to be given to the men's side of the divide. He will give a shiur to the men and not to the women. Again, in Modern Orthodox communities, it's more common that public lectures and shiurim can be co-ed. Sometimes it set up a funny dynamic. Like you look at a picture of Daf Yomi's shiur, and maybe you'll have 8 men and 3 women, or 8 men and 2 women. But at the same time, the possibility is there. So again, I would say there's this more broad issue of the value of women, the role of women. But I think there's all these more minor cases where sensitivity is called for, where it really matters. Again, eulogies, Kaddish, the women's section, accessibility of shiurim. And therefore, I think these are battles worth fighting.
I definitely agree. I'll just mention one example now to confirm what you said. Again, in my own personal experience, living in Ramat Beit Shemesh, it's a local, very Hareidi minion factory. And my daughters, when they're home, will often want to daven b'tzibor. And one time I came several years ago, it may have been before COVID even, I went with my daughter to this minion factory. And when we've gone to other shuls, both Hareidi and Dati Lumi, there might be men in the women's section, but people kick them out, at least hopefully they do. We went to this minion, and not only did they not allow her to stand outside, there is no women's section, they're just the hallway outside. But she wanted to stand in the hallway outside. There were people who dafka closed the door so she couldn't hear. It wasn't only enough that she couldn't daven inside because there's no Ezras Nashim, but they wouldn't even let her participate at all. They actually slammed the door. When I tried to open it, they'd close it. It was a little bit ridiculous. I read in a book by a commentator named Gary Wills. It's called Papal Sin. He talks about issues in the Catholic Church. And regarding the matter of women, he talks about how Pope John Paul II had a view of women, at least publicly, that presented them as so holy and presenting sex as so holy that it requires all sorts of strictures, whatever the specifics are. Essentially, he was arguing that once upon a time, women were seen by the Catholic Church as polluted. And now they want to now defend the law. But in order to defend the law without going into values that they don't want to espouse publicly, or maybe at all, they do the reverse. They now say, oh, it's not that women are less than men. They're so holy that the same law should apply. And lahavdil, but I wonder if the same thing happens over here sometimes. You talk about the value of women. We have sources that say that women are on a lower level than men, as you mentioned before, that the Hareidi world may espouse. And sometimes then it goes the opposite direction. No, they're so kadosh. They're so above men. Therefore, they require fewer mitzvot, etc.
You're totally correct. It's a very interesting parallel with Catholicism. I think it's Rav Hirsch who says that they don't need as many mitzvot for holiness. Is that correct? I'm trying to remember who says it. But I think you're right. It's not an accident that it's not an argument from the 1100s, it's an argument from the 1800s. That at that point, there was a real sense that, you can't say women are of a lesser level. So there must be other explanations for their exemption from mitzvot. But I think for many of us, like whether we want an explanation or not, we want women to have access to religious opportunities. So however we explain, I'll say this also, it's true that mitzvah aseish man grama exempts women from mitzvot. But first of all, it's not that many mitzvot. And most of those mitzvot, there's nothing wrong with women doing them. So it's true that you could quibble with talis and tefillin and somewhat with Talmud Torah, but there's no reason to dissuade women from, taking a lulav, sitting in a sukkah, blowing a shofar. These are all real mitzvot. And one of the things that frustrates me, maybe I'll throw this in very briefly, even things that really are clearly halachically okay, women are giving a hard time. And the greatest example is zimun, right? As you know, there's basically 2 positions on women making a zimun. One position is that they can, the other position is that they have to. So how could it be that women are given a hard time about zimun when the only 2 halachic positions that it's obligated or a possibility? It seems to me insane.
Yeah, I once heard, I don't know if it's true, but I once heard that Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was asked about women saying zimun. He said, of course. And the person started complaining, but I don't think that's right. He goes, okay, then don't. But, it's like, if either, okay, you asked me a question. If you don't want to do it, don't do it. But, it's actually that you probably should. Let's move on to the next issue. You mentioned Gentiles, our attitude towards non-Jews. How is that different in the Hareidi world in such a way that perhaps modern Orthodox students are getting a message that their parents might not like?
Okay, so here, before I get to specifics, maybe it's an example to even just talk about terminology. Which word you use is very powerful. Even when you just said Gentiles and didn't say Goyim. So again, I'm not saying everybody who says Goyim is anti the non-Jewish world, but I think each word has its resonance, and very often in the Jewish vernacular, let's have a greater negativity than saying non-Jew or Gentile. All the more so if people start using terms like Schwarza and things like that, then for sure it's unacceptable and inappropriate and insulting. So I think some of it is the terminology used, and some of it is the assumptions. Like, do we assume that non-Jews are, spiritually and morally challenged beings who have potential in these areas, or do we view them as kind of, they're just like the sideshow for Jews? They're just like the background needed to enable Jews to flourish and do their thing. So I think these are huge assumptions that really do play a role, which again, most important for me would be in the ethical treatment of them, right? I think it's a lot easier to treat them less ethically if one does not think of them as, spiritually valuable beings. But I think it also plays out on the secular studies level. Like if I think that, non-Jews don't really have it, so why would their wisdom affect me? But if I think they're spiritually interesting beings who really could appreciate God's universe, so maybe their wisdom is of great relevance for the modern Orthodox community. I think we should, be wary of a discourse that kind of puts them Gentiles as human beings per se, and it invalidates their wisdom. I should throw in one more thing, Scott, which we didn't plan ahead of time, but I think it is important, and maybe you have an insight actually. So I was someone said to me that Rabbi Meir Schiller did a podcast about my article, which was quite interesting. I only made it through the first 8 minutes so far, but he makes a very interesting point, which he's right. And I need to think about how to respond. He says that my writing tends to address the intellectuals of the community and not the common man of the community. And there is a certain truth to that in the sense that, let's say I'm talking about sensitivity to, are they going to influence us not to read Kierkegaard? But maybe like the average fellow is not going to read Kierkegaard with or without the influence. So I do have a response, but I just want to put that on the table. That it is something I have to address at some point. Like some of these points, are they really for the totality of modern Orthodoxy or more for a smaller percentage?
I'm actually surprised with that criticism, only because, admittedly, you're writing, the people reading the article in particular, it's a somewhat academic approach on some level. But the issues you're speaking about, you mentioned it right now, whether we call non-Jews Goyim or Gentiles, a general attitude, and this entire way of thinking about things applies to everybody. It's not about, are they going to read Kierkegaard or not? We're talking about subtle messages. In fact, it's almost entirely the subtle messages, the implicit messages, rather than the explicit messages, which worries me the most. So I don't really hear that criticism personally.
Great job. And I don't have to think about it anymore. You've solved it for me already.
I will say it's actually in some ways ironic, even though this is sort of a side point. Growing up in Maimonides, I was in Rabbi Isaiah Walgamuth Zatzal, his shir in Birei Tefillah, BH. We used to learn about Tefillah, and he said, quoting, I believe, Rav Soloveitchik, that it's wrong to say in the morning, Shlo Asani Goy. We should say Shlo Asani Nochri, simply because the term Goy does not mean non-Jews. It means Jews and non-Jews. Jews are called a Goy Kadosh. So even though the term Goyim has, in a colloquial sense, in a common sense, come to be a negative term that is, or at least understood as a negative term for non-Jews, the Goyim in this sort of pejorative way, in terms of the actual linguistic meaning of the term, it doesn't mean that at all. Nochri means a non-Jew, whereas Goy just simply means any nation, including Jews.
Yeah, absolutely correct.
Let's move on. How about secular Jews? You say there are messages about secular Jews that are fundamentally different in both worlds.
Okay. This, I think, might be the most powerful one because it really touches on the nature of Am Yisrael in the land of Israel, which is a super important issue right now. And again, one could have various critiques of secular Zionists, and some of them are quite legitimate. But I think there's a certain bottom line that in my mind cannot be ignored, which is in the early years of the state and before the state, the secular Zionists did the lion's share of the work. They were the ones who, drained the swamps. They're the ones who fought the battles. So whatever criticism we have, The state of Israel is an amazing story, right? And everybody must owe a debt of gratitude to the state of Israel. When you think about where Am Yisrael was in 1946, right? We just gone through arguably the worst tragedy in Jewish history, right? We had European Jewry decimated, and that was the center of Jewish life, certainly for Ashkenazim. So where do we go from here? And it was almost like just at that moment, thank God, the state of Israel amazingly came to existence. And here's the irony in terms of the Haredim, right? They were able to rebuild their world because right? The state of Israel gave them a home, protected them, gave them health care, even allowed them independence educationally, right? With China Chatzmai. The Zionists didn't realize what they were getting into, but that doesn't change the reality. Say the same thing about the Dati Leumi world. Like, if we didn't have a state of Israel, there wouldn't be Yeshivot Hesder, there wouldn't be Gush, Merkaz Harav, etc. All this wouldn't exist. So our whole religious revival in the second half of the 20th century is really indebted to secular Jews. So this point, my attitude to secular Jewry is really important. If I come with an instinctive negativity, these people don't keep Shabbos, they don't keep kosher, so it becomes harder to give them credit, right? I somehow am motivated to say, no, real ethical greatness is only on the religious side of the divide. And then I'm almost forced to say negative things about them, which aren't really in place. This issue of instinctive negativity towards those who are not observant, I think is really gets in the way of feelings we need to have, of expressions of gratitude, of expressions of solidarity. I think you see this very much. Again, I feel badly because I'm going to come down on the Haredim again, but I guess that's the conversation. The statements, beyond whether Haredim should be in the draft, it is very frustrating to listen to the statements of their politicians and their rabbis about the draft. I'll just pick perhaps two examples. One of their Chavrei Knesset, Philip Golkaf, said that being in the Beit Midrash is harder than being on the front lines. Now, I think somebody, if he just knew or identified with Jews who actually go to the army, you couldn't say such a thing. Like, let's say his family had once had a chayal over who was just in Gaza for 3 months. After hearing from that chayal, he could say that. But you could be so removed and in your narrow Bnei world that you could say such a thing. And in my mind, it's incredibly insensitive. Or if Rabbi Yaakov Yosef says that if they draft us, we'll leave the country. How about a little solidarity with your people? How about realizing that people giving up their lives to do something that you're saying is leave the country if you're drafted. So I think I guess I'm making a little bit of a different point here. It's not just appreciating them, but like feeling part of them, right? Feeling that this is part of your world. It's your people that are out there in the front lines, not some other people that you could kind of ignore and just, spend time defensively about your own community.
The last point you made in particular is very difficult. There's the issue of hakarat hatov, the issue of appreciating them. But there's also this idea of a lack of klal consciousness that I find, an inability or a refusal perhaps to understand that the person outside of the walls of your ghetto, it's other Jews. Not that we should not care about non-Jews either, but especially if we're talking about Klal Yisrael. We're talking about Klal Yisrael together here. Back 150 years ago, the Polish peasant outside the ghetto walls wanted to kill you. I get it. You don't care about that guy because he doesn't care about you. In fact, he hates you. Today, the person outside your walls is defending you. And to discount their contributions to you, and moreover, to refuse to contribute to it, or even to claim that you're doing as much as they are when you can't show me any sources that will prove that, is very disheartening for me personally.
It's kind of like I just throw in a humorous line. So, according to legend, the Grizz was once talking to Rabbi Blau. And the Grizz, Rabbi Yitzchak Zev Soloveitchik, said that Rabbi Blau was Neturei Karta. You're actually a bigger Zionist than me. So Rabbi Blau says, what are you talking about? So the Grizz says, well, the rhetoric is being under the Zionist rule is like being under the Tsarist Russia. And the Grizz says, if you really believe that, you'd be afraid to protest because you know what the Tsar would do to you if you protested. And I think he's onto something. Like, ironically enough, the Haredim being willing to block the light rail is that the Zionists are not really out to kill them. Right? If they really thought so, they wouldn't be out there blocking the light rail.
That's so interesting. And the reason I find it so interesting is I heard that same anecdote, but slightly different. The way I heard it, as it was quoted by Aviezer Ravitsky, a professor at Hebrew University, I don't know if it was Rabbi Blau, but it was somebody who spat on an Israeli flag. And the Grizz said, that guy's a Zionist. And what he meant wasn't a fear. Rather, it was the fact that he assigns any importance to it. Meaning, if you look at the Israeli flag as something of negative consequence, you're saying Israel matters, as opposed to what he was saying was it's no different from the United States or Great Britain or Russia or Japan or any other country in the world. Assigning any value whatsoever, positive or negative, makes him a Zionist of sorts because he cares about Israel rather than not caring less about Israel. The only reason I mention that is because these slight changes in the anecdote sometimes can radically change the message that's being conveyed.
That's a fascinating example, actually, because both versions are interesting, but you're right, they're not the same story.
They're not the same story. I once heard the same thing, I'll say, as long as we're talking about it. If I could just do a small detour just for a moment, Rabbi Kitov, the author of Book of Our Heritage, apparently was once asked by one person, and there are two versions of the story, was asked by somebody, how can you be in Israel and appreciate it, seeing all the preachers, all the lack of modesty outside? And Rabbi Kitov grabbed his hand, and he walked 1, 2, 3 mitzvah, 1, 2, 3 mitzvah, and saying, every 4 steps you walk in Israel is a mitzvah. Second version of the story. Someone said, how can you understand these non-religious Jews? They're so not modest. They're so immodest. How can you deal with it? He grabs his hand and says, 1, 2, 3 mitzvah, 1, 2, 3 mitzvah. Every 4 steps is a mitzvah. In the first version, it's saying, yes, you're right. There are non-religious people here, but every 4 steps I take is a mitzvah. In the second version, he says, how can you deal with those non-religious Jews? He's saying, every 4 steps they take is a mitzvah. It's a very, very different story, even though it's almost the exact same story. Moving forward, I want to ask you about the role of divine providence. What are some of the messages that change from the modern Orthodox world that the Hareidi world is sometimes giving to us?
Okay, great. So it's very common in Hareidi discourse to say that our efforts don't in any real causal manner bring about the results, right? The classic terminology that's used is there is hishtadlus and bitachon, and we need to do hishtadlus. We need to put in our efforts, but our efforts do not actually produce the result. Okay, appears in many thinkers. I think perhaps the most famous presentation is Rav Dessler, but I want to be fair. This is an idea that goes back earlier. So, for example, you can find this in the Mesilat Yesharim as well, and the Mesilat Yesharim explicitly says we have to do our hishtadlus as kind of a tax. Like, we messed up, we sinned, but the tax is not what actually produces the result. Okay, that is one way of thinking about it. A more radical approach would be that maybe there's even some people who don't even need to do the hishtadlus. Maybe there's this Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa model lurking out there for certain tzaddikim where they could just rely on the miraculous. But those approaches, those two models, are ignoring a third model that does exist in our tradition. Like people like the Rambam and the Abarbanel really thought that God set up a natural order for it to work. It's this machinery that works, and I can manipulate it. I can function within it, but it's not just a tax. I'm actually making it happen. If I use my intelligence to have a good farming plan, I'll be more successful. That is a split. Again, it's not a one-to-one correspondence, but in the Hareidi world, you'll tend more to hear the rhetoric of bitachon and hishtadlus, where we're not actually bringing about the results. And I think in the modern Orthodox world, you're more likely to hear about efforts within the natural order. By the way, there might be a split here between modern Orthodoxy and the Dati Lumi world, but we should leave that aside for now. But in any case, again, now that might sound incredibly theoretical. Okay, what difference does it make? But I think when it gets down to it, and some of the Achronim do draw this conclusion, if I really think that my hishtadlus is not producing results, then there's a way to think about limiting my hishtadlus. Why would I do more hishtadlus? I mean, I just have to get to that threshold where I pay the tax, whatever that threshold is. Once I achieve that threshold, I'm good. As if I think my family could use a bit more money, so if I'm in the naturalistic conception, I will say, put more hours of work in, strategize and come with a better plan. I mean, I'm doing it all within the natural order. So I think that is a big split. Now we get down to differences in practice. I think it's not an accident. And here in Israel, definitely more pronounced than in America. Why in Israel, arguably, are Haredim less, eager to get into the workforce? This is something maybe our whole audience knows this, but I should say it anyway. There are massive differences between a Haredi in America and a Haredi in Israel. Like, I went to a Haredi high school in New York. We took all the Regents exams. I mean, we got a high school diploma. So any of us who wanted to go to college, even if the yeshiva discouraged it, it wasn't a problem, right? We even took the SATs. Okay, whereas you're an Israeli Haredi, I think you stop English and math in like fifth grade. Right? And that's why it's an issue when you try to get into the workforce later in life. Like you simply don't have the skills and the tools to do so. So that's right. So that question, right? How important is it for me to have work possibilities? Well, if I think my work doesn't really produce the result, I just need some kind of vague gestados. I think no question that army service would be the same thing. And who do I think is really protecting Am Yisrael? Is it fellows studying in Kollel, or is it people patrolling the Lebanese border? So, to the degree that I'm a believer in the natural order, I'm going to say it's people patrolling the Lebanese border. If I kind of deny nature and see mitzvot and Torah study as the true protection, so that so this I think is the providence thing. I think might be arguably the most significant split out there in terms of its implications.
Then let me ask you, I'll follow up on that one question, because I think people also in the Centrist Orthodox or the Modern Orthodox world don't deny divine providence. They say there is divine providence, it just works in a different kind of way. So people listening might say, wait a minute, do we want to give the message that God is not involved in our lives, some deist conception where God has left the world to our devices and he's not really involved? How, admittedly, this is not really our topic, but how would you balance those educational messages saying you're responsible for making your own money, for example? We are responsible for defending our borders, but God's also involved. How do you balance that?
So just, Scott, you're raising a good point, which I'll broaden if you don't mind. Most of this discussion, by nature, I've been pointing out some of the flaws in Haredi thinking. Most of life is a balance, and there's no question I think probably for every category, we could come up with an extreme on the Modern Orthodox side that would be problematic. Maybe I'll just do two or three. Like, let's say, non-Jews is a good example. I want us to have a much more positive attitude to non-Jews. What if I say that in certain liberal Jewish circles, you've lost any sense of Jewish peoplehood? You can't have any sense of Jewish distinction. So that's a problem in my mind. And I think the other denominations are suffering from it. I know, let's say even secular Jews. Do we lose the sense of how important Shabbos is to us? That someone who doesn't keep Shabbos, they're not bad people, but there's a real gap there that should be acknowledged. Those who have a world of halach and those who do not. So you're making a crucial point. I think we should do that for every category, perhaps. For providence, you're right. There is this danger of becoming a deist, right? That since I'm attributing everything to the natural order, so I think I'll give you here not three, just two responses. One is to say, look, I don't think God is involved every time I stub my toe, but maybe he's involved sometimes in the major issues of Jewish history. Like if someone tells me God was involved in founding the state of Israel, I'm more comfortable with that. Right? It seems like the odds were really against it, and it was a time of incredible need. So many things come together there. And to borrow from Rav Soloveitchik, we could hear God knocking on the door. Okay, but maybe I'd be less prone to do that in my individual life in all kinds of ways. Though something's lacking. People who greater conception of divine involvement, maybe they have a more intimate relationship in God. It could be that in their mincha, they have a more intimate connection. But I will say a second thing, though. I think we could be connected to God for what he set up and not only what he did right now. Meaning God made a world with amazing resources. It's incredible what we can do, what human beings can do with the resources we have. Maybe we should say, God, you gave us this Torah, you gave us a mind that can make scientific advancement, a soul that can write poetry, right? I'm really grateful for that. You didn't inspire me to write the poem I wrote yesterday. But the reason I can write a poem is because God made this world. So I would say sometimes we have to move away from the deist perspective and bring God in. But even when we don't bring God into the here and now, we have God lurking as the background of all the good things we do.
Okay, that's a very good answer, and I appreciate that. I'll also add to that, part of the idea that many people of Maimonidean bent might argue is that if God has to get involved, that almost implies a flaw in the natural order that he created. If God made the natural order to do a certain thing and he has to get directly involved, that implies there was some problem in what he created. So we almost should say that direct divine involvement on a regular basis implies a flaw in creation, which would imply chas v'shalom, a flaw in what God did himself. So in that sense, that might also be another way of looking at it as well.
It's a good additional argument.
Let's move forward. I want to ask you about the role of Gedolei Torah, because certainly in the modern Orthodox world, we don't have the same reverence for Gedolei Torah. Some might argue that we don't have as many Gedolei Torah. That's also an issue. On the other hand, the idea of Gedolei Torah as a divine oracle, that tells us everything we need to know and is infallible, which might be an extreme position, that certainly appears more in the Hareidi world than the modern Orthodox world. What are some of the problems that can accrue from a mistaken, from our perspective of Gedolim?
Okay, so in terms of the numbers of Gedolim, so I want to quote my friend Chaim Seaman, who wrote an essay in Lara House about how it's about supply and demand. That this is a really clever point, actually. Modern Orthodoxy, basically, we need one Gadol because we need to feel that our approach really is part of the tradition, is legitimate. So if we just Rav Soloveitchik, just Rav Lichtenstein, we're kind of satisfied. Where, as I said before, in discourse, Gedolim are so paramount that it's not enough to have one Gadol, right? You need several Gedolim. That being said, sometimes you might wonder, here, I guess I'll make 2 points again. If people who are really not, they might be fine to Chachamim, but they're really not of outstanding caliber. But basically, somebody has to be the Gadol, so they become the Gadol. Scott, I've never been able to figure out how to address the following point, which is every generation feels, 50 years ago, great men walked the earth, but they're not around anymore. That's silly because everybody thinks that. And yet, I have a profound sense that is true right now. Just to give you an example. And here I'll praise many Hareidi rabbis. If I thought about people who produce great Svarim, Svarim are going to stand the test of time. So let's say we go with every category. We'll start with machshava. I don't think since Rav Hutner, anyone is near in that league in the Hareidi world in terms of Hareidi machshava. Rav Hutner was definitely Hareidi, but his machshava is incredibly deep and profound. Okay, so that's one example. Let's go to, go to Chumash, and here I'll go further back, right? You go back to the 1800s, and you have people like the Netziv and the Meshech Chochma and the Malbim and Rav Hirsch, and really incredible stuff. Now, again, it's a little bit anachronistic because, it's not clear what it means to be Hareidi in 1892. But for the sake of argument, I still see where are the great Chumash interpretations of the last 50 years, right? So I would just say, despite the fact that every generation thinks that we've lost greatness, I think to a great degree we have. I don't know how many rabbis today are producing Sfarim that are going to still be around in 100 years. So that would be one of my points. The other point would be, I think we have to be open to the fact that there are great rabbis who unfortunately have weak points, who say foolish things. And it's so bad we have to take away their status altogether. But I'm not sure that's true. What if we kind of box it? They have one flaw. And I'll give you two examples, right? Maybe an example of each. Okay, there is a pretty well-known rabbi who unfortunately uses the word shvarza in his public shiurim, and it's derogatory. Now, I think this is really bad, but I'm not convinced this undoes all the good this fellow's done in his life, right? So maybe we'd have to say that, okay, here we have a rabbi who's made a real contribution in many ways, but he has a problem, and we should not try to justify it. We should not explain why it's okay, when he doesn't mean it. It's okay in context. It's not okay. At the same time, he has what to be. There might be another case where it's so egregious that it's all over. Let's say a Rav is accused of sexual abuse, and it turns out that there are enough people testifying that it's pretty convincing. Right? It's not one victim; it's 5 victims. So I think at some point you might want to say, "Okay, I'm sorry. It's not that he's a gadol with a flaw. He's just not a gadol at that point, right? Something too fundamental has happened." So just to sum up, I would say there are some very impressive rabbis, including in the Hareidi world. I don't think we currently have people of the caliber of Rav Hutner and Rav Moshe Feinstein and the like. And secondly, I think we have to be more open to the fact that there are gedolim who make problematic statements. And I think we always cover them up or justify them. It's not helpful to our community. One more. Aaron Feldman gave an explanation for yeshiva guys should not attend the rally in Washington. I think it was a really insensitive explanation. He didn't realize how, this again, when you don't understand the other world, how much the rest of Jewry have gone out of its way to try to make Haredim welcome. Notice there were no female singers at the event. That was a way to try to make the right wing welcome. Notice that there were no rabbis speaking. There were no rabbis speaking was not because it was an argument against rabbis. Haredim wouldn't complain if a conservative reform rabbi gets up to speak. So here you have an event that is important for Am Yisrael. You have the organizers going out of the way to feel comfortable, and you complain that the event is not for you. For example, because no rabbis are speaking. But sometimes you have to realize how much the other side is going out, and you have to have, as we said before, a sense of Am Yisrael. So you have an example again. I don't say we should now fire him for being Rosh Hashiva Ner Yisrael. There could be a real sense that there's something he's missing. There's an important part of life he doesn't get, and we should not feel a need to feel a requirement to justify every sentence he says.
I mean, as long as we're mentioning Rav Aaron Feldman, I don't deny his Torah greatness, but he said something else, which I think was far more egregious than what you just mentioned. I heard a recording where he was asked about davening for the soldiers, and his response was, well, you can, but we have to think about whether it's worth it, because by doing so, we're turning them into heroes that can backfire on us. And from my perspective, it's a mimah nafshach. Either way you look at it, either you believe that tefillah works, prayer works, in which case you're withholding tefillah for a political reason, you're letting people die. In other words, if you believe that tefillah actually works, you're saying I'd rather soldiers die than it have potential consequences in the future that I don't like. I'm sorry, that's an evil statement. I'm going to call it like I see it. And if, on the other hand, you don't believe tefillah works, then why are you Rosh Hashiva? That's my personal take on that. So I find that to be terrible, and it was really, I'm still not over it. I don't think I ever will. I'm sure no one who heard it will be over it. I still want to hear more about why the modern Orthodox world can see that as a negative. In other words, we may have different Gedolim, but the influence of Gedolim, what's the negative message that is being inculcated?
Okay, good question. So I'd say a couple of things. One is, gets to the Das Torah question. Like, what if we think that rabbis are experts in their field, which is Judaism, but not outside of their field? And if they get involved outside of their field, it's not going to be helpful. And that could be on various communal issues or on various personal issues. I don't think rabbis are experts on military strategy. So I'm not interested in a rabbi who knows all of Shas telling us, what the state of Israel should do militarily. I don't think rabbis should tell us who to vote for. Okay, even though that's a little bit tougher in terms of values. And on a personal level, also, I'm a big believer in autonomy when it comes to, choosing a career, choosing a spouse. So I think there could be a sense of rabbinic authority going to a place where it doesn't really belong. Right? Obviously, they should paskin, and not just psak. Like, certain hashkafic issues are relevant to rabbinic authority also. But once that bleeds into professions and spousal choice and who to vote for, I think we've gone too far. So that would be one point. I think I would also say, gets back to what we've been discussing, like ability to think critically even about what the Dolim say, which again, many people would not like, but I think it saves you to some degree when well-known rabbis say problematic things. Like, without reviewing them, but we just do problematic quotes from Avar and Feldman. So I'm sitting here in my shul in Brooklyn. He's a great rabbi. I'll follow it, and I'll even identify with it. I'll mevatel my das before the greatness. And I would say, but that's not good, because you're accepting something that's genuinely problematic. So that's where I think the independence is crucial. It's like any value. That's what people have to realize. Just like modern orthodoxy could be pushed too much, any value could be pushed too much. So even something as precious as honoring your elders, honoring great rabbis, could be pushed too far.
Okay, let's move on to the next issue. This is an issue which is in some ways subtle, and you mentioned it in your article as well. It's something which has bothered me in the past, and I'd like to talk to you about that as well. It's the issue of, for lack of a better term, perhaps this is disrespectful, but pretending that everybody agrees about everything. I've often seen among many people in the Hareidi world to take different hashkafic positions and try to show that they really actually agree. To me, it's ironic because part of what I understand is lahagdil Torah lahadira, to make Torah great and glorious, is the fact that we have shivim panim laTorah. We have different ways of looking at it, and having different ideas, different complementary, even though they're strongly different, and sometimes not even complementary, disagreeing streams, enriches everything, enriches the whole of Torah. And by narrowing everything down to say that everyone's actually saying the exact same thing actually is a disservice in terms of the depth of Torah. And I see that often happening where they'll say the Rambam and the Ramban, for example, who very clearly disagreed, actually they didn't really disagree. Do you see that as well?
I totally agree. Maybe I'll do 2 or 3 stories about this. So we once had a panel in yeshiva where every Rebbe presented a different community. Like, one was Modern Orthodox, one was Dati Lumi, one was Neo-Hasidic, one was Hareidi. And the Hareidi fellow was actually very great, a genuine fellow, and he was made a very good portrait of the Hareidi community. So someone's, it's pretty tempting to go Hareidi. The reason you shouldn't go Hareidi is because in the Hareidi world, you'll never have this panel. I understand it. There's a desire to say, people will get confused if there are too many options, or let's simplify things and say this is the Derech HaMelech. I think it's really a mistake. People need different options. I'll give you another example, which is really striking to me. Okay, to be fair, Haredi world doesn't do that much hashkafa and machshava in their curriculum. It's very Gemara centric. So, not surprisingly, they might know more Gemara than our fellows and less machshava. And when they do machshava, it tends to not be a survey of different positions. So, I was very struck by this. We have a couple of Haredi fellows who teach night Seder for us. And one of them was looking at my source sheets, and he discovered that the Rambam did not believe in demons and magic, that it's not real. And he had never talked about it. Like, this is like a 26-year-old Kohen guy. And everybody in Judaism thinks that magic really works. It's just usher. And demons really exist. You could even say that he's the majority position. Tell me he's Pshuto Shel Mikra in Sefer Shmot. You could say all of you. To not be aware that the Rambam thought otherwise, to me, that's amazing. That's real ignorance. And because it's a world that doesn't allow for different possibilities. And what you said is true. Quoting the article, Reb Dessler trying to combine Rambam and Ramban on medicine. And to me, it's just inconceivable. Anybody who reads the Rambam in the Perush HaMishnah and Psachim, how adamant he is about it's ridiculous to not want to go to doctors, and read the Ramban. How can you say they say the same thing? And maybe it's helpful. Like, I'm a Jew. I have different ways of thinking about the world. I could connect the Ramban. I connect the Rambam. But I don't have that possibility if all of Judaism has been reduced to one position. So I agree this is an important issue, and it's something I think we should feel very strongly about.
Okay, I want to ask about two more issues. The first one is faith in God, emunah.
Okay. This is a tricky one because I think it's something that the modern Orthodox community might have to deal with a little bit more. But I'll say as follows. I think we have a sense that modernity has made us realize, and post-modernity, how difficult it is to prove things. Okay, that once we lived in a world, you go back to the 1100s, and the Jew, the Christian, the Muslim all think you could prove the religion. It's just a question of who got the best arguments. But since Hume and Kant and other people, we've grown more skeptical about that, which of course doesn't mean I want to give up on belief, but it means I think belief is going to be, I'll say actually three things it means. Belief is going to be rooted in multiple sources, right? And some of those sources, are going to be experiential and intuition-based. It's not going to all be based on just sitting there and reasoning in the library. And so we might make a combination. You might say, why do I believe? Well, I think the argument from design has some power, even if it's not an absolute proof. And I'll say, and the miraculous return of the Jewish people to their homeland plays a role. But I don't think any one of them is an argument that totally silences the opposition. It's going to have to be kind of a mixture of different things. And then I would also say, what is some of the other implications that I think we have to start thinking about the kofar differently, think about the atheist differently. If once there was a thought that, well, if we lived in the 1500s, you'd kind of assume that God exists. The only question is, which God is it, as it were? So you could see somebody who denies God, they just want to have a good time. Okay, they're tired of divine restrictions. They want to go to the frat house. That's why they're an atheist. I just think today you can't say that. In my experience of life, it's not true. Right? There are people who really struggle with belief, and not because they're dying for a cheeseburger. They're genuinely struggling. Right? There are real questions to be asked. So I would say two things. Our approach to faith has to be different. It can't be so simplistic that do A and B and obviously God exists. But also we have to realize those that deny God are not necessarily evil people just trying to have a good time.
And I will say from my own experience from running a yeshiva back in the day, we sometimes would have guest speakers, and we don't necessarily know what they're going to say, and exactly as you're saying over here, sometimes those from a Haredi background, more than once, people would come in and quote the famous Rabbi Chanan Wasserman Zatzal, his piece about why people don't believe and how can you command belief. And his understanding is that because it's so obvious, anyone who chooses not to believe is a choice based on their taiva, based on their desire to do things that are against the Torah. No one could possibly not believe in God unless they don't want to believe in God. It's always a choice, and therefore it's evil. And while I 100% believe that he meant that genuinely, it's not a position with which I relate. And I think in at least 2024, it's quite damaging because kids who are struggling with it, and as you mentioned, in a post-Kantian world, it's not so simple as he may have believed, at least for many people. For those people who are struggling, to be told you must by definition be a Baal Taiva and you're evil is not healthy and generally not true. So I definitely think it's a problem.
If I just jump in, that's a great example because there's no question Rabbi Chanan is great at analyzing Gemara. Really great. When you get to Rabbi Chanan's machshava, sometimes it's not the same. And maybe it's okay to say Rabbi Chanan was great at analysis, and wasn't great at machshava, I think we should be open to saying such a thing.
Okay, the final issue that has a negative impression on the modern Orthodox world is what you describe as extreme application of values. What is that?
Okay, so here you want to do a good thing. You're standing up for a positive value, but you're so adamant about it that some other things get pushed aside. Maybe we'll talk about three values that are really great in the Hareidi world, okay, and in a good way, unless they get extreme. There's no question that they really prize Talmud Torah. They revere Talmud Torah. And sometimes Modern Orthodoxy doesn't enough. Let's say you go to Modern Orthodox's house for, I don't know, Friday night dinner. You notice that unless they're in a room you can't see, you don't see any books or svarim. Right? And how could it be? Like, that's part of life, like learning, trying to become a Talmud Chacham. So they really prize Talmud Torah. We'll come back to that. They really prize, let's say, divine providence, having an intimate connection with God through providence, and Gedolim. And they really prize Gedolim. Okay, let's say all three are real values. But here's where things get problematic. You're so adamant of Talmud Torah, somehow you can't see that Talmud Torah has to give way to the army. But Talmud Torah is what perpetuates Am Yisrael. But wait, maybe you're supposed to interrupt Talmud Torah to do chesed sometimes. And you are supposed to interrupt Talmud Torah to do chesed sometimes. But you're so adamant that Talmud Torah can't be sacrificed, you don't realize that you're doing something profoundly selfish by not joining the army. Right? So that would be Talmud Torah taken to a degree where it turns problematic. With the Gedolim, the same thing. Like, you want to have such reverence for the Gedolim, they can't be publicly criticized. There's something interesting, Scott, that I don't know if we have time to get to. Chaim Seiman again. Chaim Seiman said, in the Hareidi world, we never criticize publicly, we might just ignore. Meaning, if a Rebbe says something silly, we neutralize it by kind of ignoring it. We will not actually come out and say X is wrong. What if you need to clarify to the community that X is wrong? And just ignoring it doesn't really work. But that never seems to happen. But so now the example where reverence for the Gedolim goes well. As we just discussed before, you could say the same with providence. Like it is like the worst thing in the book, perhaps, in my article. Rabbi Victor Miller's defense of the Holocaust. It's frightening, right? To say that because Jews had too much respect for German scientists, so the Mida Keneged Mida was that they did scientific experiments on us in the Shoah. And like, what kind of conception of God could lead to that being an appropriate Mida Keneged Mida punishment? So now I would say, and Scott, this really gets back to something else you've asked me. I don't think the average Haredi on the street would say that. I do not think so. But I have never seen, I'd love to see it actually, I've never seen in print Haredi writer saying Rav Victor Miller was wrong about that. That he should not have said that. It's insensitive. It's philosophically naive, etc. That's a problem when they're taken too far. Like Rav Miller, so much like the average Modern Orthodox Jew say. I think there are various models, but we can't really explain the Holocaust. We're just going to have to live with the question. I think that would be with all the models of theodicy you say, that's where things would end up. In the Hareidi world, we have a model where no, we have to justify God all the way through, right? And therefore, we'll come up with this crazy explanation why the Holocaust was okay.
I think that anytime we take any value and bring it above every other value, no matter what, in every context, that's idolatry. It's simply a form of idolatry when we do so. But you mentioned right now another problem, which I'm curious how you would answer. The fact is that, yes, there are people like Rabbi Victor Miller who say things that are extremely problematic and offensive and things which we don't accept. But you're saying that many people in the Hareidi world don't accept it either. You just mentioned that the average Hareidi guy in the street is not really going to think that in all likelihood. So therefore, we get back to our original question. What does it matter? If people really don't believe this stuff in the Hareidi world itself, then why should I care if someone said something? The only thing that matters to me is if somehow my kid is getting that message or our students are getting that message. But if they're not, then who cares?
So the truth is, Scott, you're raising a very important critique that I'm still thinking about in the sense of how does one get a real measure of what the man on the street thinks? And I'm not sure there's such an easy answer to that question. Meaning, I tend, maybe because I'm a book person, I tend to say, well, you read the literature, you find out what people think. And in literature, I mean from, Sifrei Machshava to like Parsha sheets, right? But someone could say to me, it's not a full measure. You really have to just converse in the community for years or do a sociological study. We'll concede that I can't be so definitive about this. I'm not sure it's easy to get those answers, but I will say I think the Rav Miller example I just said points out two things. First of all, it's pretty extreme, the Holocaust one. So if I say the average Haredi guy doesn't think so, I'm not sure I could say that about all of the other examples in my article. So I think more extreme things, I admit. We should not assume that the Haredi has all these really extreme positions. But there might be some of the more simple ones we talked about that would be problematic. That's one thing I would say. I will also say it might be too easy an answer sometimes to say. It could be what will Haredi say. Everybody I quote, they'll tell me, oh, he's an extreme voice. So if I quote Rav Shurkin, he's an extremist. If I quote Rav Victor Miller, he's an extremist. Maybe it even breaks down at some point. And I'll even give you an example in terms of Rav Victor Miller. I want to do more research about this, but I'm in the middle of doing it right now. Victor Miller, Eichlers, one can buy 30 Sfarim from Victor Miller. Second point, his Parsha sheets now have become really popular on every show. Now, I admit one could say, but that doesn't mean the community wants it. It just means somebody pays for it. But certainly no one thinks it's inappropriate to be there. And I would guess that if they would be putting out Parsha sheets based on, Rabbi Lichtenstein, right, they probably would not end up in Haredi Shtibels. But be put down and taken away. So we have the books, we have the Parsha sheets. Certainly, look, I don't know how much Mishpacha magazine is, representative, but there are positive features on him all the time. Right? Just do an internet search, Rabbi Victor Miller, Mishpacha magazine. Right? You'll see that he's a pretty dominant force there. I do have to wonder, people say, oh, he's an extremist. Well, if he's an extremist, how come his books sell so well? How come his Parsha sheets are in every shtibel? And how come he's a regular hero in Mishpacha magazine? I think the burden of proof is now in my critics. Show me that he's an extremist considered, not so successful.
Okay, I have two more questions for you, Yitzchak. My first one is this. How would you answer someone who would argue, with justification, that you're citing certain extreme voices within the Haredi world, but those extreme voices are, in many cases, citing earlier sources, which are classic sources? Admittedly, obviously, when it comes to theodicy for the Holocaust, there's no old source that Rabbi Victor Miller was citing. It was his own opinion. But some of these other ideas, whether it's about women or Gentiles or anything else, come from authentic Torah sources, whether the Gemara or the Midrashim or the Rishonim or the Achronim. So if someone were to say, it's very nice that you're criticizing these Haredi voices, but those Haredi voices are actually just echoing earlier sources that you accept as well, how would you answer that?
Okay, that's another great question. With two responses once again. Number one, I think we have a very vast and broad tradition. So often, I admit it, we should be intellectually honest, the Haredi view has precedent, has representation in our tradition. What if I say the other view does also? Okay, I think we could look at Agadot Shas and have a really intensive kind of divine providence and a less intensive kind of divine providence. Right? So the intensive one would say, like, every time you stub your toe, you must have done some sin. And the less intensive one might say, oh, even though here's a good example. I'll quote the principle, Shliach mitzvah eina nizaken, that someone sent to do a mitzvah will not get hurt. So it sounds like they're right. What if the Gemara then says, but that's not true when it's Shliach hezeka? If he's doing something that's really dangerous, we don't say that anymore. You say that is a recognition of the natural order, right? That there is some kind of protection of a Shliach mitzvah, but it has its limits. If you're going to go to a really dangerous area with wild animals, there's no guarantee, even if you're doing a mitzvah. Okay, so I think that would be my first approach. We could do more examples, but not sure if it's necessary. Just to say that our tradition is vast and complex. I could be arguing that we want to side with this group in the tradition more than this. It doesn't mean the other groups are irrelevant to us, but we profoundly identify with group A and not group B. The other thing I would say is, even when the group B, the one we don't identify with, seems much more dominant, or maybe seems like the only view, I think, again, with hesitation, I should say, sometimes there has to be a sense that circumstances are not the same. And I'll give you two examples, and one where, even though it won't admit it, the Haredi world has said come to the same conclusion. Let's go back to Gentiles. If the Gentiles you encounter are the Roman Empire, and they're persecuting you, and their culture has a lot of sending people to the lions, so that's sort of be pretty negative about. Okay, but then let's say you get to the modern Western world, which again has a lot of problems. I'm not denying it, but I don't think the way America has treated Jews for its history can be compared to the Roman Empire. America has really been a pretty good place for Jews. So people like the Tiferet Yisrael and of Yaakov Emden are very alert to this. And again, I wouldn't historically contextualize everything. maybe some of the attitude changes, like when you have non-Jews who are really hostile to you, and when you have non-Jews who are passive. And you earlier sources also, right? Arguably, the Meiri is thinking in those terms. Okay, and there's a Radak that seems to indicate that as well. So that would be kind of my second category, a sense that things might be different now. I would also say here's an example where the Haredim won't admit, but everyone's changed. I think the place of women in society is a great example, or women in education. It's true. You could quote sources in Chazal that are kind of negative about educating women. Okay? But everybody's changed. Right? Think about you are a girl growing up in a Haredi community in Borough Park today, or Lakewood. You get educated through high school. Then you go to Israel for a year. Maybe you're fortunate enough to go to BJJ and get a good education for the next year. I mean, you're studying Torah through the age of 19, and you might go to an adult shiur once a week. Their great grandmother in Poland was not getting Jewishly educated through the age of 19. So I think it's fascinating. There's a sense that women in the modern world, for whatever reason, need more education than they needed in the past. And it's true that we take it further. We say they should learn Gemara, and the Haredim won't say that. The Haredi should say, I am giving my daughter the same education that her great-great-grandmother got. Nothing's doing that. Maybe Satmar Chassidim are doing that. I'm not sure. That might be the one place it's happening. But so again, the two basic answers to your question are there are different voices in our identifying with some over others. And secondly, some of the voices we don't identify with might be a sense that certain issues have changed, or in different context, be they Gentiles, be they women, or the like.
As you're speaking, I'm just thinking of one more, if I can throw out one more example, which I think is very relevant nowadays, the concept of Torah Magni Omatzli. It's this Torah guards or shields and saves. And people will often use that. We see it cited on billboards saying that Torah protects the soldiers. Now, it happens to be that Rashi says it saves you from the Yetzer Hara. It saves you from the evil inclination. And in some level, it's important not only to say that's only one voice, but to say that voice itself can be interpreted in numerous ways, not only by people nowadays, but by Rashi himself, saying it's referring to the evil inclination. And it's important to allow those voices to become more prominent. And I'll just say, only because we mentioned it earlier, when talking about avoiding a deist conception of divine providence, I realize I'm going back on something, but sometimes it's important to say God created a natural world, and he created also the internal spiritual world of a human being. To say that Torah guards against the Yetzer Hara is not to say it doesn't do anything. No, that is a real spiritual reality in our world that God created, and the fact that it may or may not protect soldiers, if Rashi says, based on the Gemara, that Torah protects us from our Yetzer Hara, that shouldn't be discounted. That doesn't mean it's just a nice musar vort. It's an actual concept. And if you learn Torah, it does protect you. Because I'll say that repeatedly. We shouldn't discount that. That is a real form of divine providence that we can actually access on a regular basis.
Yeah, very good. You're saying your shot does not neutralize the power, it just shifts it to a different sphere.
Right, that's what I mean. I want to ask one last question about your conception of modern orthodoxy in the Haredi world. Until now, you're talking about largely defending people in the modern Orthodox world from ideas that they might find problematic or that are problematic. Do you think there's an element where modern Orthodox Jews should, so to speak, go on the offensive and try to convince people outside of our world that the ideas that we are espousing are actually important for them to hear as well? Essentially, I'm saying, do you believe Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim, or at least live and let live? You have your conception, just leave us alone, don't affect us? Or is it important that we say, you know what, we actually think that some of the ideas that you're espousing are wrong, and we have to try and influence you the same way you've been trying to influence us?
Right. That's a very good question also. Okay, number one, I do think most groups should spend more time on self-criticism than on criticizing others, just as kind of an ethical stance. So in my article, if someone wants to look at the last footnote, quotes two articles which I am much more critical of the problems of modern orthodoxy. So I do think I wouldn't want I'll say this. I don't think our discourse should be dominated by proselytizing to the Haredim. It could be like a minor part. It shouldn't be our major goal. Our major goal should be to improve our own community. That being said, I think there are reasons why we should be more vocal. One is getting back to where we started, meaning let's say, okay, I'm not going to pick a name. Let's say there's a modern Orthodox, at least in theory, high school in the New York, New Jersey area, where every Rebbe espouses a Haredi viewpoint. So I think we should object to that. I don't know why parents don't object, right? And again, you might say you can't get modern Orthodox educators in Chicago and Atlanta. New York, you can. So why is it that that's okay? Right? Again, doesn't mean we should fire everybody who's Haredi, but certainly the staff should at least be balanced at a minimum. So therefore, I think those are things we have to take on. And finally, speaking this time, if a Haredi doesn't do it, okay, Elu Elu. As I said, as much as I love secular studies, if someone doesn't study Kierkegaard and C.S. Lewis, they could be a good person. There's no denying it. But there's certain things where it's really unacceptable. If we, again, I'm trying to keep going back to this, it's just the most obvious example. If we really think there's no moral and religious justification for avoiding army service, I think we should be vocal about that. I don't see why we should pretend, oh, by definition, we have to say Elu Velu. We say by definition. For certain things, we'll go Elu Velu. And for other things, I think we should just flat out say we're right. It's important for the community. The community should hear the truth about Torah and about morality.
Okay. I want to thank you for everything you said today. This was really engaging and really enlightening, and I appreciate everything that you said. And I appreciate that you wrote the article because I think it raises some very important points. And thank you very much for sharing it today with the people listening to this podcast. Rabbi Yitzchak Blau, thanks again.
Scott, my pleasure.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, the Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest Orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.